Most people don't realize how much of their personal information is being bought and sold every day. Data brokers are making millions pulling details about you from public records and the internet, then packaging and selling it, usually without your consent. That's how your information lands in the hands of scammers, spammers, even stalkers. It's why you get endless robocalls and why ads seem to follow you everywhere. That's where Aura comes in. Aura actively removes your data from broker sites and keeps it off. They also instantly alert you if your information shows up in a breach or on the dark web. But Aura goes beyond data protection. With one app, you get a VPN, antivirus, password manager, spam call protection, dark web monitoring, and even up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based fraud support. Other companies might just sell credit monitoring or just a VPN. Aura gives you all of it, together at the same price competitors charge for just one service. Start your free trial today at aura.com/hidden. Protect yourself now at aura.com/hidden.
Confronting high credit card debt can feel scary, but the good news is, if you owe $10,000 or more in credit card debt, financial relief options are now available. National Debt Relief is currently offering debt relief designed to reduce what you owe and put you on the fast track to becoming debt-free. If you qualify for debt relief, you may be able to pay back less than what you owe and save thousands of dollars. Just visit nationaldebtrelief.com. Imagine only paying one low monthly program payment you can afford and saving money as you become debt-free. National Debt Relief has already helped bring debt relief to over 550,000 U.S. consumers, earning thousands of five-star reviews and an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau. You're stronger than your credit card debt. Let today be the day you start turning things around. Take the first step and visit nationaldebtrelief.com to see what debt relief you may qualify for. That's nationaldebtrelief.com.
Hey listeners, welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast about the craft of writing history. I'm your host, Kay Carpenter. I have been a fan of today's podcast guest for quite a while. His work and his writing voice is always fresh and engaging, and something I think we all can learn from. I have been eager to ask him about it. In fact, we planned to talk about his previous book a few years ago, but life and schedules got in the way. So I was thrilled to see that he had a new book coming out, which gave me a chance to welcome Dr. Matthew Delmont to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Matt is the author of 6 books, which you'll hear a bit more about in this episode. You can also find links to all of them in the show notes. His 2 most recent books are Half American, the epic story of African Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad, which came out in 2022, and Until the Last Gun is Silent, a story of patriotism, the Vietnam War, and the fight to save America's soul, which came out just this year. Matt has also worked on numerous digital history projects, which is actually how I first learned about his work. And he's the winner of a Guggenheim Fellowship and National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award. In Until the Last Gun is Silent, Matt pairs the story of Coretta Scott King's anti-war activism during the Vietnam War with that of Dwight "Skip" Johnson, who received the Medal of Honor for his service in Vietnam before his life ended tragically after his return to Detroit. It's a combination that illuminates the meaning of the Vietnam War for Black Americans. We talked about how Matt has worked on his voice and narrative style to reach new audiences, as well as how the intriguing historical narrative pairing in this book came to be. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Matthew Delmont.
So the book that just came out, Until the Last Gun is Silent, is my 6th book. Like most academic historians, my first book was my dissertation, so it was my revised dissertation. To say for me as a writer, it's been trying to expand the range of people I'm trying to reach as readers, and then to try to find more of my own, I guess I'd say, writerly voice, to be able to write in a way that tries to capture more narrative and tries to do more to develop characters, as opposed to writing just to communicate what evidence I found in the archive. Usually for historians, that first book is just look at all these cool things I found and just try to get it on a page, and hopefully there's some sort of connections and arguments that come out there. But particularly for these last 2 books, my first 2 trade books, it's been a lot more about thinking about pacing, thinking about character development, thinking about narrative, and trying to write in a way that hopefully will appeal to a wide range of readers.
I have been a big fan of your work for quite a while, so it's very exciting to me to talk to you. But I want to start just with these kind of like basic nuts and bolts questions. When and where do you like to do your writing?
I think wherever I can find time to do it is the is the honest answer. A lot of my writing takes place really early in the morning before kids wake up and before it's time for me to get them off to school. So it's like 4:35 a.m. downstairs in our house. Got a little desk set up. So it's where a lot of my writing gets done. And then the other times it's usually trying to find a half hour here, an hour there, sometimes at my office here on campus at Dartmouth, sometimes at a coffee shop or in the library if I can find time to get away from my office at Dartmouth. But I think I really had to kind of adjust myself to the realities of what it means to do this work as someone who is doing a full-time administrative appointment as an associate dean, and then a parent of two wonderful children who are 14 and 11 now, but who, like other parents know, or anyone who has caregiving responsibilities, it's just a huge amount of work. And so I don't have the luxury that I would have had in grad school, being able to take sort of 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. It's where can I grab a half hour? Where can I grab an hour? But ideally, it would be a nice quiet spot at home is my favorite place to write.
How do you like to organize your research and writing?
I would say I'm still somewhat old-fashioned in that I will just read a book with a pencil in hand, mark up the book with the sections I want to come back to. And then I just keep kind of ongoing Word documents where I just make note of what page and what quote, whatever reference I want to be able to come back to in the book. Once I've sort of gone through different research materials, then I'll print off those notes and then kind of go back through and try to outline them, figure out which parts are going to go in which chapters. But I don't use any sort of specialized software technology, and so it's kind of old-fashioned notes into Microsoft Word.
Do you like to sort of outline? How do you set yourself up to be able to write anywhere, anytime?
So I do like to try to outline whatever project I'm working on, trying to get a sense of, what are the themes or the chapters that I see emerging, and then within that, trying to figure out what are the best examples or best quotations or best sources or piece of evidence I can use to move the chapter along. And I often find if I can have just a couple things in my mind or a couple things at hand, it helps me get started writing in a given day. So if I know that I might only have a half hour or an hour, if I know that there's this great newspaper article or a great archival document or a great segment of an oral history, I'll try to start there. That usually can get the ball rolling with whatever I'm trying to write next.
Where in your research process do you like to start writing?
So I would say I usually will try to research maybe about 50% of a book project before I start really writing it. I mean, I'll always be kind of drafting notes and trying to get a proposal together in some shape to get kind of the preliminary ideas on the page. But in terms of writing something that might actually be a draft of a chapter that might actually show up in the eventual book, I usually will do about 50% of the research before I start writing anything, just because I need to know where the story is and where it might go. I think always with historians, I'm sure with other writers as well, there's always more research you could do. And so I think the other part of that question is like, where do you stop? And so I think honestly, you never really stop. I think you kind of have to reach a deadline, just recognize, this is as much as I'm going to be able to do for this given project. There'll always be more stuff that comes out. And I think all of us as authors are in conversation with the authors who come before us and the authors will come after us. And I think making peace with, there's always one more archive you could go to. There's always one more interview you could do, always one more digital database you could consult. But at some point, enough has to be enough.
What does revision look like for you? Do you like to revise as you go, or do you like to get through a full draft?
My preference is these days to try to get a couple of chapters together, then send it to my editor and get some kind of high-level feedback on just how it's shaping up, like whether the tone and the scope of it and like enough detail or not enough detail. But then usually I'll try to get the full draft manuscript together before getting into kind of real revisions. I think I do that in part because I want to, once I can get some momentum going with writing, it's easier for me to just kind of keep that going and try to get things down the page before trying to make it perfect. And sometimes you don't really know, you don't know what chapter 6 is supposed to look like until you actually get to chapter 10. And so I think that sometimes you need to kind of let the story unfold and then take the step back and take some time away from it and then try to revise it. I say it's one of the biggest differences for me at this stage of my career versus earlier in my career is that the really meaningful substantive feedback I'm able to get from my editor now is much more detailed than what I was able to get earlier in my career. Just the realities of university publishing with university presses. Typically the editors there are more like acquisitions editors where they kind of shepherd the overall process, but it's really the external reviewers who provide some kind of high level feedback. But in terms of line by line edits or paragraph by paragraph edits, hadn't experienced anything like that until Half American, my last book. And I think it makes the final product so much better, but also it's a lot more fun as a writer to have someone who's there with you at that level of detail throughout and can be thinking about the kind of sentence structure and how the whole story is coming together on the page.
You're a very prolific writer. I would say for a historian, but I think actually just for anyone. And this is, like you said, your sixth book. You finished your PhD 18 years ago, I think.
It makes me feel old, but yeah, I think it's right. It's 2008. Yeah.
And on top of that, you've done these really awesome digital projects that I love, many articles. And as you already mentioned, you have an administrative appointment, you're a parent. How do you get so much writing done? What are the structures that you have in place?
I think for me, it's trying to get a little bit done each day and then trying to keep momentum on whatever project I'm working on. I think, and when I say a little bit done each day, I think there's some days where you can make meaningful progress in terms of writing a couple pages when the sort of the ideas are flowing and you got the sources at hand. Other days, the words are just not coming in that way, but those can be good days to do some additional research or to tidy up the footnotes or do something. So I always try to make just a little bit of progress each day if I can. And then usually week over week, things start to kind of flow together. I think I do it in part because it helps keep me balanced and sane. So I think part of my productivity might have to do with the sort of state of the world overall. So I feel like there's so much craziness in the news that I try to I don't read much real news. I don't listen to NPR much anymore. Like I'll look at some sports news in the morning and then try to shut that off and just get to work, honestly. I'll go for a run. And so I think for me, it gives me a kind of a more manageable space to feel like I'm engaging with ideas without feeling like I'm overwhelmed with the pace of everything that's going on with social media and everything that's going on in politics and with the world these days. I also do it because I like it. Like I think my favorite part of being a historian is that you get to be just a nerd professionally. You get to be professionally curious. And so being able to do research, trying to fit the puzzle pieces together, I think I keep going back to it each day, each week, project to project, because I love it. So I think that for me feels like I ended up in the right profession because it doesn't feel like work. It feels like something I really enjoy.
Your books interest me because there are some sort of broad thematic connections between them, but they're all pretty different projects, really. And I've always wondered, how do you move from book to book? How do you choose what you're going to work on next?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'd say it's usually one thing from the last project leads me into the next one. And so to kind of go all the way back, my first book project was on the TV show American Bandstand and struggles over civil rights in Philadelphia in the 1950s. But a key strand of that work was about school desegregation. And so that made me interested in busing, which became my second book, Busing for School Desegregation, looking at a number of different cities, but really particularly interested in how television media was covering these school protests. For both those projects, television was an important piece of it. And so for what became my third book project on Roots, the TV show, miniseries Roots, I was trying to think about, what are kind of these major moments in TV history that haven't really been covered in a kind of greater level of detail. And so that kind of led me to jump into that one. The next one was actually a digital book project, Black Quotidian. That was, I would say, the historical context we were living in. So this was the mid-2010s with the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests. I felt like in the classroom, I was using a lot of the same examples. And so I wanted to try to find a way to break myself out of that mode of teaching, that mode of researching, and try to find things that might be new to me. So I kind of just explored different parts of the Black press and created this digital project that was called Black Quotidian. That led directly into the last book on World War II, Half American, because I kept finding all of these examples of Black men and women in military uniform during World War II in the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier. And it was really seeing all of those examples that made me curious and made me want to learn what more there was to the story. And so that led to the research on World War II. And then when I was presenting on the book on World War II, people kept asking, what's different about the Vietnam era? And so that's eventually what led me to do this most recent book, which focuses on a lot of the kind of similar themes about patriotism and dissent, but understanding how much changed between World War II and the Vietnam era.
You mentioned already that one of the big differences in working with trade press versus university presses is just the kind of editing that you get. Have there been other things that have defined that switch for you between academic presses and trade presses?
I think editing is definitely a big one. The pace at which everything moves is a huge difference. With my first book with a trade press was Half American. And when I sent that to my agent, they sent it to a number of different editors. I think the time between proposal was submitted to my agent to when I signed a book contract was 3 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Right. Which with university presses, it can be sort of 6 months, 9 months, a year. Right. And I should be clear, I absolutely love University of California Press and Stanford University Press, what I worked with from earlier projects. And I think they're incredibly important in the broader ecosystem of ideas and supporting the work that we do. But the pace was just so much different. And the kind of warmth that the editors expressed when they were talking to me about the book project. Academics can be less friendly when talking about ideas. Right? And so you get those external reviewer reports back, and sometimes they'll say a couple positive things, but they largely focus on what's not in the project and all the things that are critical. My experience talking to trade editors was you just felt so excited and so encouraged by the project. And then obviously the other big difference is the resources that trade presses have to be able to support a book. And so, to know that they have a whole team that's trying to get it in front of reviewers, trying to make connections to be able to help me give presentations on the book, make as many readers know about it as possible, get it into bookstores. It's almost a completely different industry than what university presses are. And I think they're all important for scholars and for other writers to be able to work with. But I'm certainly grateful for these last two books they've had the kind of support they've had from Viking.
To talk a bit more about Matt's writing, especially in his trade books, I asked him to read an excerpt from his latest. Here's Dr. Matthew Delmont reading from the preface of Until the Last Gun is Silent.
To tell Skip's story fully, I needed to speak with the person who had loved him most. So I booked a flight to Detroit to meet his widow, Katrina May. As I drove my rental car to Starter's Bar and Grill in Southfield, Michigan, it struck me. I wasn't sure I'd recognize her. We had spoken several times on the phone, but the only photos I had seen were more than 50 years old. I was relieved when she waved me outside the restaurant. I recognized you from the picture on your book, she said, and the cross body bag gave away the ear professor. Katrina was a spirited septuagenarian, dressed in navy slacks and a gray cardigan. From our phone conversations, I already knew that she was matter-of-fact and funny. I could never have been a preacher's wife. I couldn't hold my tongue long enough, she once told me. In person, she had a warm smile and eyes that sparkled with mischief. We found a table near the back, and I opened the recording app on my phone, unsure what the mic would pick up over the 90s R&B pulsing through the speakers. Katrina told me her son, Christopher, would join us later, and that he was a spitting image of his father. God must have listened when he said, "I want a boy who looks just like me," she said, recalling what Skip had told her when Christopher was born. She described how, when they were teenagers, Skip had flirted with her for months before she finally agreed to go out with him. During his deployment, they wrote letters back and forth, making each other laugh and falling in love through the mail. A kind of epistolary romance, like a Jane Austen novel set in Detroit. Katrina stood by him when he returned home, through moments of celebration and spirals of despair. She spoke of a young man who had his whole life ahead of him, until he didn't anymore. As Katrina filled in the details from our earlier phone conversations, I found myself reflecting on how much Skip's story echoed the experiences of so many other American GIs. The U.S. Army was filled with young men like Skip. Poor and working class guys drawn from Detroit, South Boston, Watts, and thousands of other small towns across the country's heartland. The more I learned about what made Skip's story unique, the more I saw how emblematic it was of a generation shaped and forever changed by the Vietnam War. Like so many others, Skip began basic training just months after graduating high school. During my research, I had come across a copy of Skip's 1966 high school yearbook, The Nor'Wester, from Detroit's Northwestern High School, on eBay. After lunch, I gave it to Katrina. She ran her finger along a photo of Skip in the Glee Club, a teenager in a white shirt and black tie, smiling. "He looks so young," she said, chuckling softly. "We were so young."
Okay, so this section is amazing, and you do it so deftly that it's really easy to miss, but this is just like a little less than 500 words. You give us an introduction to Skip's life. You kind of put him in this larger context of young men serving in Vietnam. You introduce us to one of the most important sources in your book, who's Skip's widow, Katrina. It's also very moving. And I even noticed when you were reading it this time, what I didn't notice the first time, which is that her quote about never being able to be a preacher's wife is such a nice then gesture to the fact that Coretta Scott King is the other figure in this book who, of course, is a preacher's wife. Anyway, I love it. It's amazing. How did this come together? How did you think about structuring the prologue?
Thank you so much for asking, because I think one of the funny things as a historian, as writers, people very seldom ask about craft or ask about the actual writing process. And so I really appreciate it. So I think it starts with just having the opportunity to talk with Katrina, both on the phone and then to meet her in person. She is such an amazing, feisty woman. And I'm so grateful that she was willing to speak with me and to share her time with me. And so when it came time to write that section of the book, I mean, I didn't write the prologue until I'd finished the whole draft manuscript. And so Katrina's voice and her recollections and her memories were already all throughout the manuscript. But I knew in starting the prologue, I wanted to try to get at what it was like to hear her describe and to see her describe some of her recollections with Skip. And so I, as much as possible, I just tried to kind of put myself back in that restaurant, back hearing her talk about it for the first time, and try to bring that to the page with a couple of quotations from her to just get a sense of what her voice sounded like. I think it was really important for me to write a version of Skip's story that would both be true to her, but also that she'd feel comfortable about and would be supportive of. And so in approaching the prologue, I wanted to do that. I wanted to sort of get her front and center. And I also wanted to introduce her early on in the book to readers, because the book's two main characters are definitely Coretta Scott King and Dwight Skip Johnson. Katrina is definitely one of the main characters as well. And so I wanted her voice to come in early.
You've talked now a little bit about this, but I'm interested about your relationship with Katrina as you were working on this book, what it was like to work with her and interview her. But you also mentioned in acknowledgments that she read a draft of the manuscript. And I was curious about that. Was that something that she asked to do ahead of time? Was that just something that you felt was important?
It was something I felt was important. And I could say a bit about how I met Katrina. So as I outlined in the book, Skip's story received a lot of national attention in the early 1970s. And so every 10 years or so, some reporter would reach out to Katrina and interview her and ask about either the most recent theater production or film or something that had related to Skip's life, or just kind of where are they now 30, 40 years after the fact. It was actually, she did an interview with a reporter at the Detroit Free Press in 2021, I think it was. It was through him that I was able to get her contact information, because Katrina May is a pretty common name for someone in Michigan. So I wasn't able to find her just by Googling her through the typical ways. But the reporter was kind enough to reach out to Katrina and ask if she'd be willing to connect with me. And so she said yes, and he gave me her contact info. But then, the first 3 or 4 times I reached out via text and via phone call, she didn't reply. And so I actually didn't know what was going to happen. And without the ability to talk to her and get some of her story, there wasn't really enough there to be able to tell Skip's story in the way that I wanted to be able to tell it. And so I did 2 things. I sent her a copy of my last book, Half American, to kind of give her a sense of, this is what I'm up to as an author. And I told her, which I meant, is that I think her story and Skip's story is as important as any of the stories that were in Half American. And that helped to give her sort of a sense of what I was up to as a historian. But then the other thing I tried to do is just sort of think, how would a Midwesterner approach this? I'm from Minnesota. So I was thinking, how can I try to break the ice, so to speak, with someone who I have no other connection with? And so it was Thanksgiving time. I sent her flowers. I sent her a Thanksgiving flower arrangement. And that's eventually what did it. After she sent me a text with a picture of the flowers and said, "Oh, Matt, thanks so much for sending these." And then we scheduled our first phone conversation a couple weeks after that, and talked, I think, about a half dozen times on the phone before I went out to Michigan to meet her. She's about my mom's age. My mom is passed now, but she's about my mom's age. And so I wanted to, I've done other oral history interviews for other book projects, but none where the person I was interviewing was one of the central characters of the book and was speaking about one of the other central characters of the book. And so I knew that I wanted to do right by Katrina in doing this. I didn't want it to be something where I was sort of extracting her story just to make it into the book. And so throughout the interview process and throughout the book writing process, I kept her updated at each stage, shared what I had at different draft stage. And then once I had the full draft manuscript, I wanted to send it to her, both to make sure that the way I had recorded her memories was how she wanted them recorded, but also to make sure that the larger framing of the story felt right to her. Because I complement her memories of Skip with other newspaper accounts, interviews with men he served with in the 69th Armor, the tank battalion he was in. And I wanted to make sure that she was comfortable with the book. And so I was nervous when I sent it to her because I thought I had done a good job, but one never knows. I mean, I try to put myself in her shoes to see one's life on the page in that way. And so I was extraordinarily grateful that she took time to read it and that she liked it and that she said it felt true to her. I think for me, this book was, it felt very personal. I think to have the chance to try to learn more about Katrina's stories, to see how much, I mean, she was only 21 years old when she became a widow, right? And to try to get her story recorded more so than it had been in the past. She usually showed up sort of as only in reference to Skip, but I wanted to try to really emphasize the point that I think for Katrina and for other family members like her, of people who were Vietnam veterans who either lost their lives in Vietnam or whose lives were changed by Vietnam, they were part of the larger cost of the war, right? The war changed her life as much as it changed anyone else's. And so I want to make sure that perspective came through clearly, but also in a very kind of personal way.
Did you worry that interaction with her would color your perception of the history too much? You know, there's that like Jill Lepore, historians who love too much. You know, did you think about that, or did it not seem like the kind of story where that would be a problem?
It's a good question. I mean, I think for historians or for all scholars, it's always important for us to recognize the perspectives and potential biases that we're bringing into our different projects and to triangulate sources, right? So I think any oral history, one wants to sort of connect it to other first-person accounts or other archival sources, other newspaper accounts. And so all that, I would do that for any project. I certainly did that for this one as well. But I think there's a through line. It's not unique to African-American history, but it's definitely part of African-American history about being accountable and being accountable to the communities that we're writing about. And so I think that necessarily involves a level of care and I think love for the subject matter and love for engaging people, right? I think that historians are storytellers, right? We're trying to tell more full, accurate, nuanced, rich stories about the past. And I think in the course of doing that, I've certainly found it appropriate to recognize when their storytelling abilities are vital to filling in parts of the historical record that we wouldn't otherwise have access to.
I want to talk about your writing voice a little bit, because one thing I love about your writing is that it's so clear, it's so direct, it's a pleasure to read, but it also sort of gets out of the way, if that makes sense. Does that come naturally to you? Have you worked to shape that voice in your writing?
I appreciate you saying that. I definitely have worked to shape the voice. And increasingly I've tried to write the way I would teach. And what I mean by that is trying to find examples that I think will resonate with sort of students in the classroom or with readers, but to not use a lot of jargon, not dump everything I might know on a topic onto each example, but think about, how can I best sequence examples in a way that will illuminate without overwhelming? And so I think I've tried to sort of take that voice I would use in the classroom and get it more on the page, but also recognize that the way one writes, things work differently, like in terms of selecting quotations, in terms of setting scenes and finding ways of introducing characters and moving narrative along. I'm much more attentive to that now than I was at the start of my career. But I've always tried to be the kind of scholar who, if I'm going to use theory or cite other scholars' work, I want to do it in the service of advancing whatever argument I'm trying to advance. And so I don't feel overburdened by the kind of scholarly apparatus that we learn how to do it in graduate school. Also, I think I gravitate towards topics that are exciting and fun to read about. And so part of the get out of the way is like, whether it's World War II or this one, like these are amazing characters. And my job is to try to bring them fully to the reader without messing it up. Right. I don't try to do too much scenery chewing or anything like that. I try to sort of set the stage and then keep the narrative flowing as much as possible. But it means a lot to know that to know that anyone's reading anything these days is great. But to know that people actually like the way it's written, it means a lot to me. So I appreciate it.
So I'm intrigued by this note that you have in your acknowledgments about discussing with your editor sort of how you would tell the story. And it gives, I'm sort of trying to read between the lines so you can elaborate, but it gives sort of the impression that maybe it took a while to kind of figure out how you wanted to tell this story and which characters you wanted to pair and how it would work out. Can you talk more about that process, how this book kind of took its final shape?
Yeah. So my editor at Viking that I've worked with the last two projects is Ibrahim Ahmed, who's great. I really like working with him. But I knew coming out of Half American, before it was even published, we started talking about what this next book project would be. I knew I wanted it to be about the Vietnam War, but beyond that, I didn't yet know what it was going to be about. And so that's where it was a lot of iteration, kind of back and forth conversation about, should it be structured similar to how Half American was, where I try to cover a lot of ground in terms of what was happening in the war front, what's happening in the home front. I kind of approached it that way. At one point, I thought about making Wallace Terry, who's the black journalist who spent a lot of time in Vietnam, wrote a really important book called Blood. So it was an oral history of a lot of Vietnam veterans. I thought about making him one of the main characters in constellation with a couple other folks. And so I'd say there were 3, 4, or 5 moments like that where I thought, is it this? Is it this? Is that? And none of them really stuck. They didn't, in fact, they resonated. And so it was a series of conversations that eventually led me to Coretta Scott King and the anti-war side. And then once I learned to look for Skip Johnson's story, I realized that was a story that I could tell so much through that story. Part of the challenge then for me was I'd never written a book that had just 2 central characters in quite the same way. I mean, obviously, Aunt Katrina's stories are an important part of it. Martin Luther King's story is an important part of it. You see Julian Bond there as kind of a supporting character. So there are other characters who are there, but the book is structurally, it alternates chapters between kind of Coretta Scott King and Skip Johnson. That felt a little scary to me to really have to hone in on just 2 people. But I think it was the right choice. And I definitely give credit to Ibrahim for helping me sort of think through that and talk through it and giving space to not like had to rush into the next book, but to really think about how best to tell a larger story.
I think it's an interesting pairing that's working really well, but not an obvious one. And it strikes me that, Coretta Scott King is obviously a person who not only has had so much written and said about her, but has produced so much herself. There's a lot of material to draw on. And Skip Johnson, on the other hand, has had many things written about him, but he doesn't have the same sort of archive, so to speak, of his life. Was it hard then to balance their stories as you work? I think you do a great job of balancing it, but I wondered if it was a challenge.
It was. And I think to your point of is something of an unexpected approach to the topic or unexpected pairing. For Half American, obviously a lot of books are written about World War II. I think at some point someone else would have written a kind of big picture history of World War II focusing on the Black perspective, right? So I think it was only a matter of time. I think with this one, I think it is unless I came along to put these 2 figures in conversation, it's not obvious that this kind of book would have ever been written exactly this way. And that's kind of fun for me. I'm glad that I was able to kind of bring it into the world. But it did create a challenge of trying to find balance, because Coretta Scott King is a name that I think almost everyone should know. And there's been so much, in some ways there has been a lot written about her, but in other ways there hasn't. Like, she often is the kind of the figure who's Martin Luther King's wife and then widow. She had her own 2 autobiographies, but even those they were limited in some respects because they were very careful about presenting a very certain portrait of her that emphasized some parts of her anti-war activism, but didn't emphasize others. So see, the challenge for telling her story was gathering as much of what had been written about her, but then trying to find things that had not yet been written. Looking at historical newspapers was actually a really key moment for me, and figure out how to search for her in those historical newspapers. If you search for Coretta Scott King, you get, let's say, about 300 examples. If you search for Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., you get 3 times as many examples, because that's how she was referred to in that era. Even if she was the main person on the podium, she was still Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr. And so there's a lot there that scholars haven't really worked with before. For Skip, oral history was a much bigger part of it, because I had to talk to Katrina, being able to talk to the soldiers in the 69th Armor, and then being able to try to look for other kind of contextual clues about what his life would have been like growing up. So the high school yearbook I mentioned earlier, that was actually a really key source, because I could get a sense of how the school changed once they had a Black principal, and how they had a really well-resourced Black history section in the library, how they had a current events club. And so even though on paper it would have been a poor, under-resourced school economically, demographically, most students were working class or poor, there was a intellectual liveliness in the school that I was able to get from other sources. And so then I think in terms of sort of structuring the different chapters, it was really trying to find enough, I guess I'd say, the complementary parts of each person's story, so that the whole story is moving, I'd say, cohesively in unison. And I think on the Coretta side, that meant keeping her in the foreground and not letting Martin's story take over in the key parts. And then for Skip's story, it was keeping his story in the foreground, not letting the war take over.
Well, to switch gears a little bit in the last bit of our time, I want to ask some about your influences. Are there other people you read, books or writers that you look to for inspiration?
I don't get to read as much as I would like to, sadly. But I think some of my favorite work, I love Ty Miles's books, all of them. I think Annette Gordon-Reed is really amazing. My friend who's a historian, Jean Theoharis, written a really amazing biography on Rosa Parks, and then a more recent book on Martin Luther King in the North. We sort of trade ideas back and forth on our mutual research interests. And so she's definitely an influence. She told me several years ago when we were co-writing something to not pull my punches in writing. And that sticks with me and sort of think about how I choose to write the way I write. I think I have to give a lot of credit to Jean on that. And then there's a book by a historian who's passed away named Peggy Pasco. She wrote a really important book on anti-miscegenation laws called What Comes Naturally. And what I remember about that book, I mean, it's definitely an more academic focused book, but she was one of the first people I read who used the term white supremacy in a very kind of matter-of-fact way, which is kind of introducing why so many states had these laws that prevented marriages between whites and African Americans, or whites and Latinos, or whites and Asian Americans. Just very matter-of-factly, an introduction says this was about white supremacy, right? And this is 2006, maybe 2007 when the book came out. Like seeing a historian, just the clarity with which she marshaled her evidence to advance just kind of a very direct argument and claim has always stuck with me. And I think just think about the importance of evidence allowing scholars to be able to make claims, make arguments with backing. That's one of the things that stuck with me about her work.
Aside from don't pull your punches, what is the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten?
So I can't attribute it to any single person, but I would say it would be two things. I think one is to treat writing as a practice, by which I understood the various advisors and mentors who helped guide me to me both do it regularly and know that you'll continue to improve as you do it. I think as opposed to it being something that, I think honestly, when I was an undergraduate student, I didn't really understand that people wrote books. Like they just seemed to kind of come from up on high, right? But when you actually get into sort of the work of doing research and the kind of messiness of it, you recognize that there are 1,000 different ways any of these projects can go. And that part of it is just being comfortable with the messiness of it and just sort of get in there and practice it and work on it. And I think the other thing is to not be precious about your writing, to put a lot of effort into it, put a lot of your energy and your ideas into it, but then also be comfortable sharing it, being revised, being edited, and not worry so much on creating the perfect sentence or the perfect paragraph right from the start, but recognize again that it's a practice and it'll improve over time.
Before I let you go, I'm curious to know if you have another project in the works and if you're up for talking about it.
I appreciate you asking. So earlier this month, I had a chance to give 3 presentations on Until the Last Gun is Silent. I was in St. Louis, in Detroit, and in Philadelphia. Great audiences, great questions. I got this question 3 times, and each time I had to say, I don't know what I'm working on next, which is it's really scary for me. This is the first time in 20 years I haven't known what I'm doing next. Because always, if you haven't picked up on it, one of the ways I manage sort of stress or anxiety is by work. Okay, I run long distances and I work. Right, those are things that help sort of keep me balanced. I'm a very calm person. Everyone says I'm very calm, but I'm calm because I have things that calm me. But yeah, right now I don't know. I've still plan to work with Viking. Hopefully, I'll work with the same editor, and I've been running through various different ideas over the last 6-8 months. None have really landed, and so I don't know what will come next. I'm hopeful. I'm still kind of iterating on some things. Hopefully by the summer, I'll know what's coming next. In part because I love researching. Like that's part of why like I want to know what I'm going to do next. Is like it gives shape and balance to my work life to know what I should read, what I should research, and what I should be trying to write. So hopefully, if you were to follow up 6 months from now, I would know what I'm working on. But I'm in a very weird spot right now. I don't know what my next book project is.
I will look forward to it, whatever it is, and I'm very grateful to have read Until the Last Gun is Silent. Dr. Matt Delmont, thanks so much for talking to me for Drafting the Past and talking about the craft of writing with me.
Thanks so much for the conversation. It was really fun to talk about it.
Thanks again to Matt Delmont for joining us for this episode of Drafting the Past. You can find links to Matt's books and other books mentioned in this episode in the show notes and at draftingthepast.com. Thanks for listening to the podcast and for sharing it with all of the history writers you know. After all, friends don't let friends write boring history.